So we're going to start today by talking about listening to understand, which to me is really the bedrock of active listening. All the other aspects of active listening we're going to talk about today are really just supporting this main idea of you're genuinely trying to understand and connect to the other person.
This is how most conversations go. One person in the conversation will state their perspective on something, and then the second person in the conversation will state their own perspective. The first person will state their opinion, the second person will state their own opinion. The first person will state their feelings, the second person will state their own feelings. This is not an actual conversation. This is two parallel conversations where the woman's talking about herself and the man's talking about himself. And they might be talking about the same topic, but they're actually talking about two very different things within that topic, right? The woman's talking about her opinion, feelings, and perspective on something, and the man is talking about his own experience. And they're both talking about themselves. They're both talking about different things as opposed to talking about the same thing. And this is what I mean by that. In a good conversation where you have good listening, the first person will state their perspective. And then the second person will go back to the first person's perspective. They don't pivot the conversation to them and their perspective. They stay with the other person says, I see the world this way. And the listener says, oh, so it sounds like you see the world. And they keep it on that first person. The first person will state their opinion, and again, the second person, it goes back to the first person's opinion. The first person will state their feelings, and the second person will state the feelings of the first person. And so now we're having a conversation. We're not two parallel conversations. It's one conversation where we're both talking about this woman's experience of the world. That's what a good conversation looks like. So this all goes back to trying to understand the person, listening to understand. You want to understand the person's perspective on the world, and that is the point of being a good listener. I love this cartoon despite how ugly it is. You see these two men, and one of them is looking at this object and he's saying there's 4 pegs, and then the other man is looking at the object and he's saying no, there's 3 pegs. Neither of these men are right, neither of these men are wrong. Both of them are correct from their own perspective. And when we talk about listening to understand, it's about trying to understand the other person's perspective and seeing it as valid, even if you don't agree with it. Too often, we mistake our perspective for reality. We think that the way that we see the world is the way that the world is. But our perspective on the world is just that. It's one of an infinite number of perspectives that people have. And, that's not to say that some perspectives aren't more valid than others, that some people aren't more right about certain things than others. Like there is right and wrong, and people can be more or less accurate with how they see the world. But none of us are perfectly accurate. None of us are even close to perfectly accurate. And by listening to understand, you get data points about what the world looks like to other people. The world is so complex, you cannot understand it by yourself. And by listening to other people, you get to see the world from all these different perspectives. And you can't do that if you're always telling them that they're wrong, that because they see the world differently than you, they're wrong. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, right? Like they might see the world in a very different way than you, and you want to understand where they're seeing it from, but you don't have to agree with where they're seeing it from. And I think this is why we're bad listeners sometimes. If we meet someone with like very different political beliefs than us, for example, and we're like, listening to them, it almost feels like we're like capitulating, or like somehow just by being a good listener, we're admitting that they're right and we're wrong. That is not the case. That being a good listener doesn't mean that you're agreeing with the other person. And you can be incredibly curious about the other person's perspective and to want to understand that without necessarily agreeing with them. Often we don't listen to understand, we listen to judge. And what I mean by judge in this case is we immediately have a strong feeling about how the information or how the other person's perspective impacts us. And that's what I mean by judgment. We judge, is this a good thing for me or is this a bad thing for me? So one of my good friends, she's married, she's in her early 30s, her husband is an EMT, and he comes home from work one day and he's like, all right, I've decided I'm gonna quit my job, I'm going to medical school, I'm gonna get my MD. And he's like really excited to tell her this, right? It's like he's so excited about this idea and his commitment to it. And she just flips out at him. She's like, hey, I want to start a family. We talked about having kids. We can't have children if you're going to be gone all the time studying, if we're going to be broke because you're going to school. You are not going to medical school. That is not happening. And they got in a huge fight about it. And of course, what was happening is he was sharing this news with her, and her first, where our mind just implicitly goes, is how does this information impact me? How does this impact me? And that's the first thing that she thought of. So instead of being like, hey, okay, so like, why do you want to do this? Why do you think now's a good time? How do you think this will affect our plans to start a family? Instead of like asking him questions and trying to understand his perspective, and he may have had great answers to all of those questions. Instead, she immediately jumps to a conclusion because based on how the information impacts her personally. That's what I mean by judgment. When someone tells us something, instead of being curious and open and trying to understand it, we often immediately jump to the conclusion of this is good for me, this is bad for me, and we act based on that. So avoid doing that. And my friend, I mean, she's a good friend of mine. She's not a particularly selfish person. This isn't supposed to be a critique of her. This is just a natural human thing that when people tell us something, we immediately go to, how does this impact me? The irony is that the closer we are to someone, the more we care about them, the more difficult it is to be non-judgmental. And that's because the people that we're closest to, their lives are intertwined with our own. And so whenever they make a decision, it's going to have a really powerful impact on someone. And the closer you are to someone, the more their decisions affect you. So whenever they tell you something, you always go to this place of like, okay, but how's it going to affect my life? I heard an NPR story about a woman who started a nonprofit to help mothers who had been alcoholics and were now sober reconnect with their family and like kind of undo the damage they had done through their alcoholism. And she was talking about these women and how much empathy she had for them, that they had like done these things because they were alcoholics and been bad parents, and how much they regretted it and wanted to reconnect with their family. And she had so much compassion for them. And yet she wouldn't speak to her own mother, who had been an alcoholic when she was growing up, because the pain is too direct, right? That she was the one who suffered from her mother's alcoholism. So for these other women, she can have compassion for them and see the story from their side. But from her own mother, she's unable to do that. She's unable to be non-judgmental because it had such an impact on her. So it's this irony of human relationships, that the closer we are to people, the more judgmental we are of their decisions and their perspectives on the world. You know you are really good at listening non-judgmentally when someone tells you that you're a jerk and the very first thing you say is, tell me more about that. Like, man, I don't think I'm a jerk. Convince me. Like, what makes you think I'm a jerk? I'm genuinely curious. And not in this like condescending, oh, tell me why I'm a jerk. But like this genuine, like, what about my behavior makes you see me that way? And to genuinely try to understand their perspective of you being a jerk, and not get defensive about it. And of course, remember, just because you're trying to understand them doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't mean that you have to agree that you're a jerk, but you at least want to understand why they think that.